Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. It is right at time for us to get started with this webinar. My name is Camilla Roberts. I'm the president of the International Center for Academic Integrity, or ICAI, and we are very happy that you are all joining us for our third and final part of this Going Remote with Integrity, where today we're going to be focusing on the way your academic integrity policy and procedures might have changed or might need to change in this virtual environment. Just a couple reminders before I hand it over to our presenter, Dr. Orr. This webinar is being recorded, and so you will be able to have access to the entire webinar as well as PDFs from the slide after the webinar. Our two previous webinars are on our website, academicintegrity.org/webinar. You'll be able to find them there. Throughout this time, we ask you for bandwidth, please stop your video, and then you should be remained muted throughout this entire webinar. We do have a chat room that there are several moderators, Tricia Bertram-Gallant from University of California, San Diego, Amanda McKenzie from University of Waterloo, Jean Guerrero from University of Monterey, and then myself, and I'm based out of Kansas State University. So we will be checking that chat box and answering your questions, and also compiling questions for us to be able to ask Dr. Orr at the tail end of our presentation. So again, please know this is recorded. You will be able to gain access to all the information after the webinar, but we're very happy that we have Dr. Orr, who is also our treasurer for the ICAI, but he has a great deal of experience with policy and procedures, and so we're very happy that he's taken some time to be able to put together this presentation. We hopefully will be hopeful it will be useful for all of you. And so at that point, I will turn it over to James.
So thank you all for joining us. Just a little bit about me. My name is James Orr. I currently serve as an assistant vice provost in enrollment management at Virginia Commonwealth University. I've been working in academic integrity now for over 14 years, and I've worked at institutions that did not have a formal, what you would often hear as an honor code, to institutions that had a traditional honor code, to institutions that have what people would normally call a modified honor code. So I've worked with the spectrum of academic integrity. I also teach higher education law and policy, and I've done that for the past 7 years. Today I'm going to talk about Going Remote with Integrity 3.0, your academic integrity policy gone viral. Now, before I do that, I want to start off with a caveat, is that we know that the true promotion of academic integrity involves a coordinated campus conversation and involvement from students, faculty, and administrators. And what really works best really depends on your campus, your culture, and really what's acceptable in your current environment. What we're going to do today is to present some strategies that come from the research and from some case law that we think might be beneficial and helpful to you. Now, as I do that, I always tell people that when I think about academic integrity policies, I don't think about it in the terms of just how we respond in terms of conducting hearing panels and conducting case investigations. I also think it's important to think about it in terms of how do our policies and our operational procedures align us to do preventative measures in terms of outreach to students. And then how do we create an ethos that really is conducive to something where academic dishonesty is something that's not a part of our culture or who we are as an institution. So as I go through the presentation today, the very first thing I'm going to do is to spend a little bit of time, not a whole lot of time, on sort of ethos, the culture that you're trying to promote, collaborative outreach and programming that's designed to prevent students from being reported for academic misconduct, and then if they are reported, so that they'll have a better understanding of your process and procedures. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about the policies and procedures and best practices and things that might need to be changed in our current environment. So I'll start off with the ethos very quickly. I think that it's important in everything that we do that we try to find ways to ensure that we're promoting a culture in which academic integrity is something to be revered, honored, and upheld. Oftentimes I hear people say, how do we stop students from cheating? And what I found that is it's really not about how do we stop students from cheating, but it's how do we really promote a culture of integrity and honesty? And how do we demonstrate a personal commitment and help faculty demonstrate a personal commitment and a connection to the careers of students that academic integrity plays? So how do we really create this community of trust and authentic learning? And we know that this is often particularly challenging in the online environment. And the last point is that students and faculty have to be engaged because they're really the heart and soul of academic integrity policies and procedures. I think it's very important that as we're thinking about our policies and procedures and we're talking about how do we remind students about the policies and procedures, that we find creative ways to let students know that it is important that if they identify or they're concerned about academic misconduct, that they report it. Because doing that really enhances the value of their degree, and it creates this community of trust that we're trying to create. One of the stories that I love telling is that when I was at Virginia Tech and we were doing significant revisions to our academic integrity policies, we didn't put a requirement in the policy that students report cases of academic dishonesty. But what we did do is we appealed to the ethos and the values of students and let them know that they had a responsibility as a member of the university community to uphold the value of their degree because it would impact them not only while they were a student, but when they graduated. And what that institution found is that we went from having about 2 or 3 cases of academic dishonesty reported by a student per year to over 40 and 50 cases a year being reported by students. In that same vein, it's important that we communicate that a similar message to faculty, that even though we're going into a remote environment and that many of us are operating in very uncertain times, that it's still important that they report cases of academic misconduct as they occur. So we talked about the culture that we want to create surrounding our policy, but then it's also important that as many institutions have moved to a remote environment, that we find unique ways to communicate about our policies and about our procedures and any changes that has occurred. The first way that I encourage people to do is that many institutions are creating keep on teaching websites where they give strategies to faculty on how to teach in the online environment and best practices. I think it's important that we promote those and we communicate those on our websites, that we partner with centers for teaching and learning to talk about ways that we can encourage pedagogy that really discourages academic misconduct from occurring. ICAI, we did 2 webinars that Tricia did and Doug did one that really got at how we could design assignments and assessments in a way that promoted integrity and reduced academic misconduct. All of those are things that we should encourage to be out on our Keep On Teaching websites if you have those, or websites for teaching and learning. We should also, even in our current environment, send periodic emails to faculty, reminding them about the institution's policies and procedures. We should offer webinars for faculty. I think that folks who are responsible for the adjudication of academic misconduct, oftentimes you see the type of situations and the challenges that the institution has, and that you can present those webinars or you can partner with other faculty to do those webinars. We really want to be seen as a resource in providing strategies for administering online exams, and even just a resource for faculty in general through holding virtual office hours. So if you are a faculty member and you have questions about whether a student's actions constitute academic misconduct, you know that during this time, the Student Conduct Office or the Academic Integrity Office or the person in a college or school responsible for academic integrity, that they have these hours where you can drop in and just ask them questions. But we also want to provide information to our students and be very intentional about doing that. Many institutions have created Keep On Learning websites. That is one of the critical pieces that we can provide to students, tips and strategies for how they can best learn in the online environment, how they can avoid academic misconduct, but also how they can be successful as a student. Because part of the success of our policies and procedures during this time period is to demonstrate that we are compassionate and that we understand what our students are going through, and that we're not simply trying to react to academic misconduct and punish students, if you will, who are found responsible for engaging in some form of academic misconduct. Periodic emails to students about reminders about why integrity and honesty is important is good. One of the things that I've also always done is publish case data in the student newspaper and on our website that showed the number of cases that were resolved and the sanctions that students received. I know that sometimes people get uncomfortable about showing case data, but what I found is that when you're showing case data and you're publishing that in the student newspaper, what it does is it says to the university community that the institution does respond when academic misconduct occurs. Several campuses have implemented new policies and procedures that's designed to reduce the anxiety that students and faculty are feeling during this time period. And I think that from an academic integrity perspective, when we think about educating and figuring out how do we make students aware of resources that will help them be successful, that we should include information about some of those policies and procedures. So we should partner with our student success offices and units, our academic advisors, and let them know about new pass-fail options that students have and other options that students have that will really reduce the anxiety that they feel about being in the new environment. And because when you do that, that also decreases the likelihood that academic misconduct will occur. Virtual honor code sessions are important. One of the things that I've always done in person is have a session where we tell all the faculty that the university's academic integrity office is going to be hosting a session where we talk to students about how do you avoid academic dishonesty, what are some tips and strategies to be successful as students, and here's what the university's process is. We found that many faculty would offer extra credit to their students to attend one of those sessions. And in our current environment, it's a lot easier to do that, particularly now that we're doing it online. So the question that I will pose to you to consider is that when you think about your policies and procedures, before you think solely about how do I respond when academic misconduct occurs, I think you should ask the question first is, what are things that we can do to promote and support a culture of academic integrity so that academic misconduct is less likely to occur? And furthermore, how can we engage campus partners in the processes that they are developing to reduce the anxieties and uncertainties that students are feeling? How can we engage them as partners in that endeavor so that we can also promote a culture of honor and integrity? One of the things that we did here at VCU is that while I don't work directly with academic integrity, the adjudication side, I was able to engage academic integrity education and promotion in the various sites and websites that we were developing to encourage keep on teaching and keep on learning. Virginia Tech and their team was able to partner with the Dean of Students Office and the Office of Student Conduct and various other offices to say, here are the resources that are available to students to help them be successful so they don't get in a situation where they make poor decisions and exercise poor judgment. So I would encourage you to consider how you might promote and support academic integrity to the campus community. Now, the other piece, which is so important, is our policies and our procedures and how we adjudicate cases. And now what I'm going to do in this section is I'm going to run through some ideas and suggestions and philosophical thoughts on how we might do that. The first thing that I'll highlight is that it's very critical that we understand today's climate. Many of our students are now being put in an environment that they're not accustomed to learning and engaging in. And many of our faculty are also being asked to redesign their courses in the middle of the semester, and they're not accustomed to, many of them, to teaching online. And so as an office that is responsible for academic integrity, as we're thinking about our processes, we have to make sure that we are student-centered and learning-focused. So when we see a case, we have to ask the question, does this really constitute academic misconduct? Or is this a situation where the expectations really weren't clear? And I think more so than ever before, we have to do that in the current environment. And I would also argue that many of our institutions will be asking us to make that evaluation as well. And so we really want to cultivate a situation of deep reflective thinking in which we encourage honesty. And one of the things that you'll hear me say several times from now forward is that not every case of academic misconduct requires a hearing panel. There are multiple ways in which we can resolve cases of academic misconduct. So I would encourage you to stop and consider how a move to the online environment might impact the academic integrity violations. How will these be reported and managed, and how can you support faculty? Now, the very first thing that I encourage people to do, because I'm going to talk about some changes that you can make to your policies and procedures, is that when we're making interim changes to our policies and procedures, most accrediting bodies will require us to make a note that something of the effect of what I put on the screen, the rapid evolution of COVID-19 pandemic has caused us to do X, Y, and Z, and then the time period for which it applies. So some of the things that I think can be considered for changes to policies and how we do that is that, does your policy and procedures allow you to make very easy changes that don't require going through the entire governance structure? What I did on 2 campuses is that I found it was very helpful to divide policy from the actual procedures. And because those institutions have a policy and then they have an operations manual, it's easier for them to adjust to climates like this. But if your changes to your policy require an extensive review through the entire governance, one of the things that you're often able to do is make interim policy measures that are usually approved by the president or the provost that can impact how you address academic misconduct. But as you make interim policy measures, I will encourage you very strongly not to make changes to your standards of evidence or the definitions. And so when I say standard of evidence, that means that if you use preponderance, don't go to clear and convincing. And if you're in clear and convincing, you shouldn't move down to preponderance of evidence. Now here I will make a note though, that if you do have a standard of clear and convincing or beyond a reasonable doubt, I would encourage you that after things blow over to reconsider that, because when you're using those type of standards of clear and convincing and beyond a reasonable doubt, it makes it extremely difficult for you to adjudicate cases of academic misconduct in the online environment. The other thing is to consider is due process and confidentiality, which I'll talk about that in a second. But let me give you a couple of things that you can do right now. One is that I would encourage you that if you're not doing this, to do what I call a pre-process review of cases. So many times, many institutions, when a case comes in, they automatically start putting it through their formal process and procedures. I think that when a case of alleged academic misconduct comes in, that is absolutely critical that you review the case and talk to the faculty member, talk to the student, so that you can understand that it is a true academic misconduct violation, or is it a situation where because of the new climate, the faculty member was not clear with their expectations and the student's misstep was really a result of just unclear expectations. Again, there are multiple options for resolving cases of academic misconduct. I listed a few here, but one of the things that I'll tell you is that if you are writing a memo for one of these ways that I've listed to resolve cases of academic misconduct, you just want to make sure that you maintain the campus's intent. So do they believe that students should be in the majority for resolving cases? Do they believe that faculty and students can sit down together, have a conversation, resolve the case, and then report it to a central office? Or does the campus believe that an administrator should be involved? I think we should think very critically about the sanctions that we assign, because again, we're in a situation where faculty and students are engaging in an environment that they're not accustomed to. So we should think very critically about the sanctions that we assign and whether or not they're appropriate in every situation. I know some institutions have one-strike sanctions that automatically result in expulsion from the institution. I think we should reconsider that. and see if there are other sanctions that can be assigned that would help us achieve our goals of educating students. We should consider extending time limits. So maybe a case normally has to be submitted within 5 business days or 5 class days. So maybe in the current environment, that might be extended for a little bit. And we want to ensure that our language provides flexibility and that we truly understand due process. Now, due process, and I'm going to talk about it from a US context. What I would encourage you to do is that whether you're in Canada or you're somewhere else, that usually there is a process that the courts give you that describes the minimum things that you are required to do. And you can go above that, but what I want to encourage you to do and to stress is that when we talk about due process, it does not mean that we have to create these elaborate systems with multiple levels of review, because many times those things take so long to resolve, and it often creates very adversarial situations. So here's what due process is. So I've listed the cases in the United States that establish due process, and I'm just going to go over to you what due process is, and to really stress that if we are doing these things, at least from a US context, then we have fulfilled our due process requirements. The one is that we give students notice. So we tell them what the charges are, we give them an opportunity to review the evidence that's provided against them. And one of the things that you'll hear me say in a little bit is that I believe that we should give students the evidence. I see a lot of where folks are trying to say, how do I share the evidence with the students so they don't download it? And I understand why that's a concern, but I do believe that we give them the evidence. Now, from a due process perspective, we're just required to show them the evidence. We have to tell them the date, the time, and the location of the hearing, and usually we have to give them 2 to 10 days to prepare for the hearing. When I say hearing, I use hearing loosely because not all cases are required to have a hearing. It could be an administrative meeting, it could be a hearing before a board, it could be a facilitated discussion. But the point is that we give them an opportunity to be heard and to respond to the allegations. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to make a decision, and that decision has to be based on the facts and the evidence that's presented. That decision can't be made based on what we think of the student or the student's previous violations. We really have to make a decision on whether or not the student has committed academic misconduct. And then we have to give them a sanction that should be, and normally it should be very educational, but it needs to be aligned with the actions that the student has taken. And again, if you have policies where your normal sanction, even though I'm not a fan of this, where the normal sanction is a 0 on the assignment, or you have very low level sanctions, you shouldn't increase those sanctions blanket in this environment just because it's online. The last thing that you have to do is to record what happened, and that's simply providing a response of what happened in writing. If we do those things, we give notice, we give hearing, we tell them the decision, sanction, and a record, we fulfilled our due process requirements. Now, the notion of appeal, at least in the US, the courts don't require that we give students an appeal. I believe we should give students an appeal, the opportunity to appeal, but I wanna encourage people to avoid automatic appeals. It's so easy to say that because of the environment that we're in, if a student is unhappy with the outcome, that we're going to just grant them an appeal. Or we create multiple levels of review. I was at one institution and they would have a hearing panel, and then there was another board that reviewed it, and there was another board, and then it had to go before the provost for review. And really, we're going well beyond what we are required to do from a due process perspective, and we're not even creating a fair environment for the student because we're showing a lack of confidence in the disciplinary process. So if you're given an appeal, give an appeal, but it doesn't have to go through multiple layers of review, and it shouldn't be an automatic appeal. So what I want to do now is jump into some of these tips with case investigation and case resolution. But the one point that I will stress that is so important in the online environment is that we are consistently and frequently communicating with faculty and students who are involved in the case. From the time the case is received, we receive the case. When the investigation starts, hey, we started the investigation. After meetings, we're giving updates, that we're really communicating with faculty and with students throughout the process. And then when we're finished, that we send a brief survey that says, tell us how we did in terms of following the process and in terms of communicating throughout the process. So hearing process, I just listed a couple of things that I would consider. What's your current method of notifying students? Does your institutional policies allow you to carry out a hearing by phone? Who sits on your hearing board, and do you have flexibility for that? Some other things that's important to consider as we go through the hearing process is the digital divide. Not all of our students have access to internet, and not all of our students have access to computers. So when we are thinking about our hearing panels and we're structuring them, or even our meetings with students, we have to think about those things. We have to think about the language barriers that sometimes exist, and even telephone access. For our hearings, it's important that we conduct training with the hearing board members in an online environment, that we update our scripts to reflect the online environment, that we discuss with them confidentiality. Now, when I say discuss with them confidentiality, one of the things that I want to stress is that we have to tell students and faculty or administrators who serve on hearing panels what the expectations are. But then we have to trust that they're going to follow those expectations. I like to encourage them to use headphones when they are participating in a hearing panel, to encourage them to be cognizant of their location that they're participating in a hearing panel in, and reviewing evidence. And most importantly, that we practice with the panel members prior to the hearing. I think it's important that when we think about sharing documents with students, that we really err on the side of fundamental fairness. There are softwares that are available that allow you to prevent documents from being downloaded. But at the end of the day, if we should communicate our expectations to students, and we should do our best efforts without going through exhaustive measures to try to ensure that the students do what we're requesting and asking of them. Confidentiality. We should stress the importance of confidentiality. Maybe before you start a hearing panel, you scan the room for the student, so that so you have the student scan the room so that they can show no one else is sitting in on the hearing. But at the end of the day, it's really important that we communicate our expectations, and then we have to trust that students are following the rules and the guidelines that we have set up for a hearing panel. Because oftentimes some hearings don't allow anyone to sit in, other hearings only allow an advisor to sit in or one person to sit in. But it's very important that we communicate our expectations and we do our due diligence to ensure that it's being followed, but we shouldn't develop these huge draconian processes to make sure that the student doesn't have anyone sitting in on the hearing with them. And at some point, we may have to consider delaying hearings at the student request if needed. When you have a hearing, I'd encourage you to have an IT person on standby. I encourage you to do a pre-hearing meeting with the student where you plan and discuss how witnesses will access the hearings. Some students will want to call their witnesses on the phone. So you all should practice that and really encourage them to be part of if you're using Zoom or WebEx or whatever you're using, to be part of that, as opposed to a telephone call that the student calls and puts the student on the speakerphone. The point is that we have to practice that. Again, I would encourage the student to use headphones. You should always have a telephone option or number where the student can call in to the hearing. It's also important to utilize features as Zoom, WebEx, and most of your sort of conferencing softwares have, such as Weight Room. I encourage the usage of breakout rooms so a student and an advisor can talk. You want to control screen sharing. You can use the raise your hand feature. So if you see that a panel member has a question, you want to remember that you're recording. If you record your hearing panels, you want to continue to record those. And you also want to have someone who is assigned to control access to the meeting. So right now, Camelia and Tricia, they're controlling access to the meeting. They're keeping track of if folks have questions. So you want to make sure that you have someone do that. You want to ensure that everyone is logged out before you start deliberations. And it's also important when you share hearing packets and things of that nature with panel members that you share the standards for deliberation, the standards of evidence that you're using. So what I'm going to do is very quickly go through just a sample hearing process. So normally you want to have a hearing board. Your policies usually dictate who sits on your board. If you're writing interim policies, then you want to make sure that you are including the folks who would normally sit on a hearing panel in terms of representation. And you want to make sure that you're doing that within the spirit of the institution. So if your institution is an institution that is faculty heavy and faculty are in the majority, even if interim measures are approved for you, then you should make sure that faculty are in the voting majority. Or if it's students who are in the voting majority, you want to make sure you do that as well. The point is that if you require hearing panels, and if during this time period, you have to ask for an exception to the number of students or faculty who sit on the panel, you just want to make sure that you stay true to the intent of your policy in terms of who's in the majority. And then when all of this blows over, I would encourage you in the future to consider language that doesn't say it has to be 5 students or it has to be 5 students and 3 faculty, but instead include language that says students should be in the voting majority or faculty should be in the voting majority. So normally if a student has to go to a hearing panel, you'll give them an opportunity to discuss the charges. Typically, a committee will make a decision on if a student is responsible or not responsible. And after they make a decision on if a student is responsible or not responsible, they'll determine what the sanction is if the student was responsible. I listed normal times and normal things that will allow, that we can use to grant a student an appeal. One of the things that I listed is that while we should consider sanctions, that just because a student doesn't like the outcome does not mean that the students should be, the sanction should be changed. And further is that when we are evaluating sanctions, one of the things we also should consider is, so if the proper procedures weren't followed, was it something that was very minor that had no impact on the outcome of the case or the outcome of the decision? And if so, is that something that really warrants an appeal being granted? So we should also consider now what will be our responses to lower level violations. Can these remain in the online environment? And what type of educational sanction would be most meaningful to students in the online environment? One of the things that I listed was something that I created at Virginia Tech and at Mississippi State was an academic integrity student success learning module. So if you have presentations that you do on academic integrity, you may be able to put those on your learning management system and use those as a way to educate students who are found responsible for violations. Again, I want to stress that you can use alternatives to hearings, whether they are administrative hearings, faculty-student resolutions, peer-to-peer adjudication, guided facilitated discussions. We should be very creative about the ways that we seek to resolve cases, while knowing that not all cases have to go before a hearing panel, particularly in this environment, because what we're trying to do is to educate students and to help them learn and to help faculty and students get through these unprecedented times. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that our processes and our approaches are educational, that we're using these situations as teachable moments, and that we're engaging faculty and students in this process while still allowing for due process. Because one of the tendencies in this situation and what we're currently working with is that people will automatically assume that I just have to get the case resolved. How do we get the cases resolved? And we want to get the cases resolved, but we want to do it in an educational manner. And we can use the strategies that we're using to conduct meetings in our everyday work environment to do that. Now, the last few slides that I'll show is how I believe that as we talk to students who are reported for academic dishonesty, and as we talk to faculty who are working through these processes, I think we need to be intentional about how we explain the process. So what I'm going to go over in my next 4 slides is a process that I think is so important that we use when we engage students. So when we see a report of academic misconduct and we schedule that meeting with the student, I think the very first thing that we want to do is not just jump into the case, not to start talking about, you've been reported for academic misconduct, here's why you've been reported. We really have to demonstrate a care for students, because many of our students are really going through very difficult times, as we all are. So when we meet with a student, we want to introduce ourselves. We want to break the ice. We want to explain our role, ask questions about the student and how things are going for the student, because we want the student to know that we understand that this particular violation that is before us is not who the student is as a person, that we care about the student genuinely and we care about their current situation. After we do that, though, then it's important to help them identify what they have been accused of, and to identify that with them, to ask them if they know why they're meeting with you. And if they don't, to show them why they're meeting with you. And then take time to explain the charges and to explain the relevant definition. Because remember, we want our process to be a learning-centered process. Then we want to have the student reflect, right? So do their actions constitute, or are their actions consistent with the values of the institution? Does it match their own values and who they are and what they strive to be? And then after we have engaged them in this moment of reflection, then we can move to the part where we explain to them the process and we explain to them how the process works. What I did is highlighted a few slides from a sample presentation that I've used at 2 institutions, and to give you a description of how this would work. So a case of academic misconduct is reported. The office receives the case. They schedule a meeting. Remember, you'll see here that I put provides a case facilitator. Some institutions feel strongly that students and faculty should not meet together. Other institutions meet together in terms of if they're reported for academic misconduct, because they believe that there's a power differential. And some institutions believe that they should just meet with an administrator. So what are the values that your institution has? And then after you understand those values, you meet with the student and someone has a conversation of what they've been accused of and what their options are. And usually their options are something like this. They can accept responsibility for committing a violation of an honor code or an academic integrity policy and accept whatever sanction the university is assigning. They can accept responsibility but not accept the sanction, or they cannot accept responsibility and they may just say, you know, I'd like to speak with somebody more about this. But throughout all of this, however we choose to do these things, it's important that we're consistently monitoring timely resolution of cases. Are we being fair from a distributed perspective? So are our sanctions consistent? Are we following our proper process and procedures? Are we interacting with students and with faculty in a way that's conducive to a learning-centered approach? And then are we sending surveys out to make sure that we're getting feedback from students and from faculty? And then we should include that in our regular annual report that we do. So that's my presentation. I tried to go through the last few slides very quickly, but we will put these slides online. And so now I will pause so that we can go through some of the questions that folks may have.
Great, thanks so much, James. Really appreciate it. There was a lot of chatter in the chat box. So I've collated some of those and added some questions I have myself. And there was a lot of questions just around policy, best policy and process practices that I'm going to stay away from those, since the webinar's about how to take your existing process and policy virtual, and they were more of like just general questions. But perhaps we need to do a follow-up webinar on that. In the meantime, I just want to caution folks, and to repeat what James said, to be careful not to make changes to policy or process in this, in this current environment without careful thought and deliberation, following the proper institutional approval process for doing that, and announcing any changes to campus. So I just wanted to reiterate that point, James, that you made earlier, and make sure people heard that.
Yeah, and Tricia, you're absolutely right. That is such a vital point, because the last thing you want to do is to do something that is inconsistent with the institution's infrastructure, and that would lead to later on some type of litigation. So, yeah.
Great. Okay. So let's move on to the questions. So There was some questions. You mentioned a pre-review process and how that might be very important right now because maybe more so with the quick shift to remote instruction and exams, students misunderstood the standards or expectations more than normal. And there were some questions in there about who should do that pre-review process. And before you answer, James, I would just say, again, it depends on your institutional policy. For example, my policy does not allow my office to tell faculty that this isn't a violation. And so you want to make sure that you're allowed to do that before you do it. But so if you're allowed to do it.
Yeah, and even if you're not allowed to do it, you can be strategic. So let me answer this in three parts. One is if it's not part of your policy, one of the things that you can do is to have a conversation, usually with your VP, who would consult with with the provost, because some institutions may enact interim policy measures, which is what I was getting at. Some institutions may enact interim policy measures to support, and that's just for the current environment. And so you would have to work through your chain of command to establish that. But many institutions in the current situation, if they evaluate that the interim policy measure is really something that is in the best interest of the student, they will usually, a lot of times they'll be able to do that. But if you can't do that, let's suppose that you have a policy in which you can't say to a faculty member, this is academic misconduct. I do think that if you are an office that does reviews of academic dishonesty, what I found is that most faculty really appreciate someone who will just have a conversation with them about the incident. So how can you, if you look at it and you see that it's a situation where maybe the faculty member was unclear, so how do you strategically have a conversation with the faculty member? So can you tell me more about this violation? Okay, so here's how the process works, and you talk them through the process and you really have a conversation with them. But if the faculty member says to you, no, I want to move forward, or if you're uncomfortable saying, you know, this really looks like a miscommunication, then you would send it through your normal process. But my point is that we often get into the habit at many institutions of when a case comes in that we immediately send it through the adjudication process without at least looking at it. So when I say a pre-approval process, I put that in quotation marks because I'm not talking about a formal body that looks at it. I'm saying that when a case comes in, we should at least look at it on its face value to make sure that we are best advising faculty and students.
Great. Thanks, James. So there was a couple of questions about software platforms for online processes, like sharing documents, case tracking. Some people are still using paper, for case tracking, hearings. Not that we want to endorse any particular products, but do you have any suggestions for that? And then kind of a follow-up to that, how do we make sure that students or faculty or whoever is not then, now that they're going to have electronic access to stuff that maybe they didn't before, how do we stop them from inappropriately sharing that and violating maybe confidentiality laws, like in the state's FERPA, or in other countries, maybe different laws?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I would say, if you don't have and I won't name any systems, but if you don't, Tricia gave me a subtle reminder, so I won't name any systems, but if you don't have a conduct management software, oftentimes your learning management platforms are really good for sharing documents and getting access. So I would contact your IT folks to figure out how you can create your own website within the learning management system to manage some of those cases. The other thing in regards to ensuring that faculty and students aren't sharing information, I think it's important that we communicate with them. And that's why I go back to having a conversation with the student and the faculty member as much as we can when we receive cases. Because oftentimes we think about this from such a legalistic perspective that we think, I can't say this, I can't say this, I can't do this, I have to just send it through the process. I think it's very important that we have conversations with students and we have conversations with faculty during this time period, that we post expectations so that they're clearly communicated and that we communicate those expectations in writing. But what I found in my experiences, that has allowed me to be successful leading academic integrity initiatives on multiple campuses is that communication and that human touch and really being intentional about doing that.
Yeah, thanks, James. And when it does have to be more formal, we find simply notifying people. I'm
Yes.
reminding people, don't distribute this. You know, it's not fair, it's not responsible, it's not trustworthy. So that can also just be helpful. People don't usually do these things out of spite or ill intent. They're just not thinking. So tips for conducting resolution meetings with students. So on some campuses, there was in the chat box, it's like faculty do all of that. In other campuses, it's conduct or integrity officers. Any tips for conducting those virtually? So for example, you know, if I'm meeting with a student in person and they start crying, I can pass them a tissue box, right? I can't do that virtually. So it feels less personal, it's harder to make that connection. And then a kind of a follow-up to that. So crying is one example, but another one is parent or sibling, you know, Zoom bombing, so to speak, your virtual meeting, and maybe even trying to participate and answer questions for the student. That is bound to happen more than it did in the past when the person would have had to show up in person. The parent would have had to show up in person.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that I believe is important to do, and I listed this in the slides, and is that we are compassionate, and that as we're compassionate, that when we have those situations, we acknowledge what is occurring. And so if the student is crying, the student is really upset. So I see you're upset. And really taking a pause to use our instincts and be compassionate. I think that using the structure that I gave you will allow you to do that. One of the things that we used to do at my former institution is we trained students and faculty on how to have these very difficult conversations with students that they weren't having every day. So we taught them to first engage the student. So you show that personal interest in the student and establish that connection. And then after you've engaged them, you begin to identify. And then after you've identified, you begin to reflect. And then after you have helped them reflect, then you go to the let's take action. But really, in order to do that, we have to think about our process and procedures and make sure we're following our process and procedures. But we have to think about the student as a person and as an individual and establish connections with them that way. I would say that if a parent is Zoom bombing or they're popping in from behind the screen, so they're hid now and they pop in, that you would handle that situation very similar to how you would handle it if it happened in person. It's very difficult to say to a student that your mom or dad or whoever can't sit in on this meeting, but if that's your policies and procedures, then you would let the student know that, and then you would follow those policies and procedures and discontinue the conversation if they didn't want them to leave. But what I found is that I try to evaluate if the student has allowed the mom or the dad to sit in on the meeting, and I don't see it as being disruptive to the meeting, then I'll usually let that happen. But a lot of that depends on what your policies and your procedures are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We talked about, again, kind of pre-notifying students, reminding them of the policy and procedures. We've also found sometimes, even in person, the student is giving us a look like, I don't want them here, but I have no choice. And so paying attention to that as well. So we're finding if we're giving some students some language ahead of time. So if they don't want their parent there, they could say, sorry, mom, you're not allowed, right? The university said so, and giving them that ability to vocalize their wishes with their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you, for hearings, so there was a few questions around hearings. Any changes? Are there any changes to the script that might be necessary for virtual, remote / hearings? How do you deal with inherent problems that are not present in in-person hearings, like people losing connectivity? Maybe the student doesn't have a camera to show up, quote unquote, in person, that type of thing.
Yeah, well, one of the things is first, each case you have to evaluate whether or not it's a situation where the hearing has to occur, or is it something that can be deferred. I discourage deferring. I say you only defer unless it's a very extenuating circumstances, very high level case where you may think you may have some litigation or legal repercussions later on. Then you might consider deferring. Other than that, I think when you adjust the script, you let the student know that it's being recorded. And if it's recording in person, you let them know that as well. I talked about a pre-hearing meeting. So if you do a pre-hearing meeting with the student or with your panel members and with the faculty member, you let them know all the resources that you're using. So if you're using a waiting room or a breakout room, you let them know that you're using that. You let them know how you access that. And then if there is disconnectivity and things of that nature that happen, many times you have to proceed. And if you proceed and maybe you are a panel member short, you can, usually that's grounds for the student to have an appeal. But one of the things that I tell people is that you're not going to be able to anticipate everything that could possibly happen because many folks are learning as it goes. And as you see situations, you want to use your professional judgment to resolve the situation and to make sure that really the student is being heard. Because as I said earlier, the fundamental tenet of due process is that the student is given an opportunity to be heard, that they're unheard, that they're heard by an unbiased group. And that's what you're really striving to do.
Yeah. And there was kind of, as you were talking, there was a follow-up question, not just, you know, a parent or a sibling in the room, and this is particularly around hearings, but students texting, maybe with each other or with a parent or attorney. So there's concerns about that. And I just don't know that there's much you can do about it, frankly.
No, you can't do that. Even if the student was in person and they were texting with a friend or an advisor who was feeding them information, there's nothing you can do about that. The thing that I do is I always try to, in the pre-hearing materials that the student receives and in the conversation, I try to talk the student through, you know, if you're texting with someone and every time you're asked a question, you have to, even if you have an advisor, you have to lean over and get a response from the advisor. It really gets at the credibility of the statements that you're making.
True. Yeah, so you could say to students, if you're having to look down, you know, on something every time before you answer a question, then it's going to look, you know, the board may judge that or something, you know. You want to explain why you're looking down. That's good practice anyways. Yeah. How do you see the current situation, this remote instruction, remote exams, changing the type of misconduct we see, if at all?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I'm glad, Tricia, you're on here because Tricia and others were doing a lot of work around contract cheating and from someone else taking the exam for a student to paper mills and a host of things that occur in regards to contract cheating. So I think that we have to be more aware of that. While we also know that the research suggests that academic misconduct is not more likely to occur online than it is face-to-face. I think that sometimes we have that perception though. But I do think that we'll have to be aware of things like contract cheating. I think that there will have to be a focus on pedagogy for faculty. And so how do you best teach online? Because we have a whole generation of young people now who are being introduced to the online environment that wasn't introduced to that environment before. So many institutions are asking the question is, will some students want to take classes online as opposed to your traditional residential experience, if you will? So we really have to think through those things. And earlier I mentioned the idea of our standard of evidence. I think that, and a lot of groups talk about this a lot though, is that when we have beyond a reasonable doubt and clear and convincing, oftentimes it makes it very difficult to resolve cases of academic misconduct that happen in the online environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it continues to be questions about hearings. You know, there's some suggestions that you require the student to keep their phone in view throughout, you know, can we require that students appear by video? What if they say they don't have a camera? Is that a good reason to delay a hearing? What if students record hearings or take photos or images of the hearing? So I'm just sensing from the chat room a lot of anxiety around hearings. Yeah,
I think what I would always go back to is what is due process, right? Yeah. What are we required to do? I would highly discourage us saying to a student, you have to use a video. We can encourage them to do that. But I don't think that it would be that it's wise to require that they do that. We should communicate our expectations to the student, and then we go through our normal process. Because if a student is sitting in front of you in the hearing and they're texting, you're not going to take their phone. And so if a student says that I feel like my hearing, I can best make my argument over the telephone, and we are in the sort of not in the remote environment, you're not going to say to the student, well, you can't have a hearing panel because you don't want to come in person. And so we have to remember that when we are in the online environment, that there are some unique differences and challenges, but then there is also some things that are established procedures, established protocols, established ways that we approach things that don't necessarily change when we get in the online environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's kind of a punctuation, an explanation point on it is two things. That the communication piece is super important all the time, but perhaps even more now because people will expect things to be different, and we have to reassure them that our policy and our process is the same, even though it's virtual. So I think that's really important. And I think it's also really important to use this as an opportunity to maybe rethink, to be innovative in the sense of rethinking all of the rules and kind of guidelines and or even if they weren't formal written rules, the way we insisted on things before, this gives us a chance to rethink them. And as you said, is this really necessary for due process? Is it really necessary for educating the student? Is it really necessary for fairness and trustworthiness, respect, responsibility? So I think that's a really good point that maybe
and Tricia,
take a breath and reflect a little bit.
Yeah, because you're absolutely right, because we are telling and encouraging faculty to rethink how they teach, and we're encouraging students to rethink how they learn, and we have to do the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There are some other questions that aren't really related to virtual, which is why I left them at the end, but there's a good one about how would you approach if faculty are resistant for student involvement in the development of process or policy or the revisions of policy and process. How would you get students in there, knowing that that's the right thing to do for them to have a say, but faculty are resistant?
Yeah, well, the first thing so it could be two things. So if we're saying, how do we get them involved in the adjudication piece, right? So how do we engage and get students involved in the adjudication piece because faculty are resistant? One of the ways that I found to do that very much so from an incremental perspective is that you may get a group of students that you train to do presentations and to do outreach events, and have those students participating in presentations and outreach events. Trisha's you've been doing this a long time with your students who work in your academic integrity office, having them do presentations. Camellia in Kansas State has been doing that. Virginia Tech has done that as well. So the point is that you can engage them in the education and the outreach components. And many times when faculty see students who are able to talk about integrity and honesty in a clear and concise manner, in a well-informed manner, you begin to shift the culture on a campus. If we're talking about how do we engage students in policy revisions, I think if you're having a campus review committee that's reviewing policies and procedures, sticking one or two students on that review committee is always good, or dividing them up into work groups.
Yeah.
The point is that when we think about academic integrity systems and even sometimes conduct systems, we immediately go to the adjudication piece. But the education and outreach piece is as important, or many times more important. When I was at one institution, that campus did not want students to be, they felt because of the culture, students shouldn't sit on panels and judge other students if they're in the majority. And then I went to another institution, and that institution, student run, student engagement, student service on the boards was very much so part of the fabric of the institution. So at the previous institution that didn't want students serving on hearing panels and making decisions on cases, what I did is I engaged students in education and in outreach, had them do presentations, had them proctor examinations, and that really helped the campus turn a tide towards allowing students to be more engaged. And now that campus has students who sit on their hearing panel.
Great. Thanks so much, James. We just have a minute left, so I'm going to turn it back over to Camilla to close out.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, James. That was a lot of good information. And I think a lot of people is going to be able to take some things back and relook at how they might be doing things. I know we've got hearings coming up this week, and so there's some things that I'm like, oh, maybe I should think about that. So thank you very much. Just as a reminder to everyone, you will receive an email with a link to be able to view this webinar as well as the PDFs. We encourage you to take a look at our website to see the previous webinars if you happen to have missed them. You are able to share these with other people, so we encourage you to send it out to colleagues that you might have. And James has put up his contact information, so feel free to contact him if you have particular questions, or if you want more questions about the policies and procedures and developing them maybe from the start. He has a lot of great experience, so I encourage you to take a look at those. If you have any questions about ICAI or anything else that we're doing, please contact info@academicintegrity.org. So thank you all for your attendance, and we do hope to have some more upcoming webinars scheduled over the next few months, so be on the lookout for those. Thank you very much. Bye. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.